most favorite quote on the board. This was kind of just her theory. She was a muckraking journalist, and so this was her theory behind how to get what she wanted said out in the world. And she did that through a lot of, not meanness, but it wasn't very nice, I guess. So growing up, she was born in England in 1917, and her parents were Lord and Lady Redesdale, and they weren't very high nobles or high in the monarchy, but they were up there, I guess. She was one of 7 children, and she had only one brother and 5 sisters. The oldest was Nancy, and she was a novelist and a biographer. And she wrote 2 autobiographies about their family and growing up, and one of them was made into a movie. Then there was Pamela, and then there was Tom, the one and only brother. He was a lawyer, but he studied a lot of music, and then he died fighting in the war. And then there was Diana, who married Sir Oswald Mosley, who was the leader of the British Union of Fascists. So she was very for the fascist cause, and she and her husband went to jail at one point because they were informed on by Nancy, the oldest sister. Then there was Unity, who was also very pro-fascist. At one point, it was rumored that she was going to marry Hitler. She was kind of in his little circle of groupies, and she and Jessica actually shared a room as children, and one side of the room was very pro-communism, and one side was pro-fascism. And then the youngest was Deborah, and she also was a writer. None of the girls went to school, but Tom did, though Jessica really, really wanted to go to school, and her parents just would not let her. And then the communism versus fascism was just, her family was all very impressed by Hitler. They had all met him, and they liked his cause, and she was very anti-that. In 1937, she eloped to Spain with her second cousin, Esmond Romilly. He was also Winston Churchill's nephew. While they were in Spain, he was a journalist, and he did anti-fascist writing during the Spanish Civil War. So they were on the side, I think, of the Republicans in Spain. They have 2 daughters, but one died at infancy. And then eventually they returned to England, and they were very active. They worked against the British Union of Fascists, so they kind of turned out pushed away her whole family. And they were pro-Labor Party, so they were pro-union, and they also worked for the International Brigade. And then eventually they moved to America, and they owned a restaurant there and did different things there. And Esmond joined the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he died during World War II. So then she moved to Washington, D.C. and worked for the government. But she met a lawyer named Robert Truehaft. I'm not sure how to say his name. They were married in 1943, and then they moved to San Francisco the same year and joined the Communist Party together. And he continued practicing law there. He was in the lawyer team or whatever that first brought charges of police brutality against African Americans to the state of California. And they had 2 sons, and one of their sons was hit by a bus when he was delivering newspapers on a bicycle when he was 10. And then communism was a big part of their life. Jessica was not a very good homemaker. She did not enjoy cooking or cleaning or any of that. So she got a job with East Bay Civil Rights Congress. She was the executive assistant of Herschel Alexander, who was the executive director of that group, and he was also African American. The group was kind of seen as a communist group, even though they weren't. Many of their leaders were non-communists. They were pastors and teachers and just people in the community. But most of the people that joined the group were African American, and it is said that they had more people more African Americans in that group than in the NAACP for that area at the time. With this group, she traveled to Mississippi with the white women's delegation, and she helped campaign for Willie McGee, who was accused of raping a white woman, and then eventually he was executed for that crime. In 1953, she and her husband were called before HUAC. I saw an interview by her, and she claims that she got up there and she would not answer any single question they asked. So she and her husband both refused to inform, but they were still not really accused of anything. They were not charged, and they were just kind of released. After that, in every newspaper article, anytime their name appeared in the media, it said their name and then it said identified as a communist. But she really didn't care all that much because she was, and that's just what happened. Then in 1955, she was mistakenly issued a passport, even though she was not. They didn't want her to leave the country, and she knew that there was communist concentration camps in America, and so she and her family not fled, but they went to England with her passport against what they wanted, and just to stay there for a while and to escape what was going on. And then in 1958, they left the party. They still had their communist beliefs, but they wanted to focus more on the civil rights movement. They had made friends with a lot of African Americans in the civil rights Congress, so they just wanted to focus on that. And her husband continued to work for or defend different African Americans. I'm going to read a little part. One of her books was about this part in her life. It's called A Final Conflict. And I'm going to read just what she was saying about leaving the party. She said, looking back, it seems that in the 40s and 50s, the party had become essentially a self-defense organization, or rather had been maneuvered into that position by the unremitting attacks on it. By the time Bob and I joined, the glorious days of the CIO organizing drive and the San Francisco waterfront strike, when the Communist Party was on the offensive, had reached into history. With few exceptions, communists had been effectively driven from union leadership. This sense of being beleaguered and embattled created a fortress mentality in which the party had become increasingly turned inward. The morale and elan that marked its days of achievement and growth during the 30s was gone. Morale was sustained by faith alone, and inevitably, in this circumstance, faith had become a dogma. While there was much exhortation to broaden out to seek contract among the masses, and the Civil Rights Congress, we had to some extent succeeded in this, Bob and I found that our circle of really close personal friends was becoming more and more limited to other party members. This was partly due to the successful efforts of the government to isolate us, but it was also partly our fault. We tended to drop our friends and associates from the pre-party days because we now had so little in common with them. Furthermore, I fear we were tiresomely self-righteous, or should I say leftists, taking a superior and patronizing attitude to those of our acquaintance who had not seen the light as we had. And yet, what other organizations were responding seriously to what seemed to us the urgent issues? The liberals, with few glorious exceptions, has fallen back in disarray and in effect joined the Cold War years. Despite all evident drawbacks, I can hardly imagine living in America in those days and not being a party member. And then I'm going to show you, this is an interview she did later on in life. And she's just kind of talking about her view on HUAC, and you can kind of see how funny she is just based on this little clip.
Not quite. Anyway, I first arrived here really before the great waves of red baiting began. This was in 1939 when the New Deal was riding high FDR was the president, and there was a thing on the horizon called the House Committee on Un-American Activities. This was a fairly recent thing. It was called the Dyes Committee after its founder, a person called Congressman Martin Dyes from Texas. Well, to me, the whole idea of a House Committee on Un-American Activities was rather comic. I mean, I was trying to visualize what a parliamentary committee on un-English activities would busy itself with. I mean, possibly what would its role be? Perhaps it would monitor people who refused to observe the hallowed ritual of afternoon tea at 4:30, you know, or who made jokes about the royal family. Who knows? It couldn't do anything. Actually, the early actions of the Dyes Committee were also pretty amusing. One of the first things it did was to list Shirley Temple, then aged 9, as a dupe of the communists. And then later, in another report, it labelled Christopher Marlowe as an un-American, indubitably, quite correctly so. So in other words, it was a sort of rather amusing moment in the history of America. And friends of mine used to go around singing, "I wish the flies were eating dyes deep in the solar plexus," that sort of thing, you know. And but anyway, that was just before the war. After the war, the joke stopped. Now, you will be hearing, and have heard already, during this entire conference, incredible stories of whole families devastated, careers broken, wrecked, and so forth. Well, Bob Truhaft and I, living in Oakland, had only a worm's eye view of some of this kind of thing. But the first time that I ran afoul of it in a personal sort of way was really when I got a job with the San Francisco Chronicle. And this was, for years, I've been the secretary of the East Bay Civil Rights Congress, which was on the Attorney General's official subversive list. And that folded in about 1956. And I found myself nearing middle age without anything to do, without any job or marketable skills. So I got the most real rock bottom job that I've ever had, which was answering the telephone, or rather getting on the telephone all day long, in the San Francisco Chronicle's advertising team, that is for classified advertising, where the job was to ring up the classified advertisers for cars or real estate or anything of rival newspapers and try to get them to switch to the Chronicle. So I'm sorry to tell you that I was incredibly good at this. Well, I won 2 bottles of domestic champagne and some tickets to a free movie, that sort of thing, until just a few weeks after I was getting these marvellous honours and awards for my work, which I was told was extremely good. I was called in by the supervisor until my personality was not suited to the job. Well, I gave her quite a grilling. Anyway, it turned out that the FBI had been round to see the boss and had told him, not that I'd done anything, but that I was under surveillance as a possible subversive, and that was enough. In those days, that was really enough. So I was fired from this incredibly stupid job. And I thought, well, my life's come to an end. Of course, Bob, my husband, said, well, you knew all along that it was classified work. It didn't really help. So that, in a word, is what drove me to writing, because that's the one trade where you don't need any prior experience or education or special skills. You can just start doing it.
So she was a very funny lady, and she just kind of took the Cold War. It almost seems as like a joke. I mean, she really didn't take it seriously. She went in front of HUAC and was just, I'm using my Fifth Amendment right. I don't care what you want. Let's see. So then I'm going to talk about her writing. She was a muckraker, which is really a term that was not used at the time anymore. It kind of died out in the 20s and 30s. But it is journalism that that gives an accurate account of corruption and social hardships caused by big business. It's all about exposing injustice in the world and kind of bringing down the big guys that are controlling everything. It began in the early 1900s, and I know most of us have probably read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, but that's probably the most widely known version of muckraking that anyone in America at least. So her muckraking was all about the death and prison and such in America. The book she first wrote was The American Way of Death, and it kind of just exposed the funeral business and what the undertakers were doing to charge people money and hike up prices, and when really that didn't need to happen. She talked about what the public was told versus the reality of the situation in all cases. And she really liked talking about the sales techniques that the undertakers use to sell caskets, and you can get springs or foam in them. What would you like to spend the rest of eternity on? Things like that. Her second book was Kind and Unusual Punishment: The American Prison Business, and for this book she toured prisons all over the country. She was really showing just where all the money was going to in the prisons. We were spending so much money on these prisons, and it wasn't going to the people who lived there. It was going to the management and the supervisors. And so people who were imprisoned, while they should be imprisoned, they weren't getting treated very well. And her last book that was kind of muckraking was The American Way of Birth, and she talked about how doctors were overusing cesarean sections and things like that, just the problems with the labor and delivery in hospitals around the country. And then she actually wrote a book called The Poison Penmanship: The Gentle Art of Muckraking, just to kind of talk about what she did and her theories. She used accuracy in all her writing. She thought that was the most important thing. You can't write something without it being true. And then she also used wit to victimize her people. And I mean, she would call people names in her books and just things like that. She also wrote The Trial of Dr. Spock, the Reverend William Sloane Coffey Jr., Michael Ferber, Mitchell Goodman, and Marcus Raskin. This was about this trial that they found the first four of them guilty for conspiring to counsel evasion of the draft, and Marcus Raskin was actually let go. But the purpose of this book was just, she argued that the use of federal conspiracy laws meant that Americans were not actually as free as they thought they were. And she was just showing the injustice in this trial, but it was just an explanation of what had actually happened. And then she wrote 2 autobiographies. Hans and the Rebels was about her young, growing up with her sisters and everything, and then also about her first marriage. And then A Final Conflict was about after her time in the Communist Party and things like that. And then, so her impact, she really inspired other writers. Investigative journalism had kind of fallen to the wayside when she had written The American Way of Death. So she kind of encouraged that on. There's people who after that wrote books about the wedding industry and how much money people are spending on that, or the auto industry and things like that, just big business that wasn't really what it should be. Her book, The American Way of Death, got the Federal Trade Commission to set standards for the funeral business. They had never done that before, so this was a very new thing. And then she also really stood her ground. She refused to inform on herself or anyone else in the Communist Party when she went to HUAC. And she also, even though she left the Communist Party, she still held her communist beliefs. She still liked socialism and all those ideals. And so even though everyone was telling her not to do that, especially her family, she kept to her beliefs, and she and her husband survived through that. Yeah. And that's all.
What questions or comments might you have for Hannah?
I mean, it seems that she really didn't like succumb to the fear at the time.
Yeah.
Do you have any like other thoughts or insights of why that was? Was it like a personality thing, or?
Yeah, she was, in reading about, like, her growing up, she was kind of a stubborn person. She ran away from home at one point when she was younger. She would, I don't know, she just was a very, she believed what she believed, especially when her whole family was not into that. That's a hard thing when you're a teenager, to not believe what your family believes. And it said, like, she and her sister Unity would hurl books at each other about each other's beliefs about fascism and communism, and they would scratch the swastika and the sickle into the windows with a diamond ring, and she just did really weird things in her life. But I mean, that was just, I think it was part of her personality, and then also, it probably also had to do with the people she married. Both of her husbands were very pro-communism, pro-socialism, and so that kind of helped her, her husbands, they brought her into that a little bit more. Yeah.
She didn't seem to have suffered much punishment for being so outwardly
Yeah, she
resistant.
kind of seemed to stay to herself. When she wrote her books, which wasn't really having to do with the Cold War, but she got a lot of, backlash from, especially the funeral directors. They were not happy with her.
Right.
I saw, or at the end of the interview I showed, when she was speaking, what I showed you, she told this story of, she went to some little town to their library and spoke, and I mean, she was just, the funeral directors were all livid with her, and they all sat there, and she called them the black suits. That's what she calls them. And, they were just, why would you say that? That's not, I'm in the business of, this is Jesus' vault. I'm selling vaults, things like that. And she was just like, you really don't understand. Plus, she was atheist, so she was kind of like, whatever. But she didn't suffer as much backlash as most people for the age, or for the time. But, I mean, she still was able to kind of, I think it was partially just because she kept to herself, and she mainly focused on civil rights, and that was a big that.
Which by itself, by the way, wouldn't have made her very popular.
Yeah. No.
Do you think because she was not American that she wasn't as afraid as people here were?
Yeah, she eventually got her American citizenship, but she did know that she could always just go back to England and be more accepted there. Not necessarily accepted, but she felt more at home there, and people were more willing to just be with her and deal with her background and things like that.
Maybe you mentioned this before. I didn't pay attention enough. But did you say why she left England to go to America?
She and her husband just decided they wanted to go to America. They lived in New York, and then they moved to Miami and opened a restaurant.
Gotcha. So it wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily that there were like issues that she wanted to like address. Okay.
Not really.
Just a
She
random
was
life
just,
choice.
you know.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They moved in 39, right?
I think so.
Yeah,
Somewhere around
the
there.
coming of war might have influenced
Yeah.
that a little bit.
That's true. And right after she moved to America, when Britain declared war with Germany, her sister Unity, who wanted to marry Hitler, actually attempted suicide. And so she was, that was like, I mean, even though she wasn't friends with Unity really, because they're butting heads, but, she really was struck by that, I think, a lot. That was hard for her to deal with. And then Unity didn't die then. She lived for like 9 years after that in a nursing home, and then she died.
You know, I would, in answer some of the questions about why she didn't suffer a little more persecution from HUAC and others. I would infer from your presentation, and you may have a sense of this since you've spent a lot of time studying her, that she really was a charming woman. I mean, you can sort of feel that in the YouTube video, and she talked about in that video how good she was actually at talking advertisers into coming to her newspaper. So, you know, I would infer from all of that there was a quality about her that would just be difficult to be angry with or to stay mad with because she was simply as charming as she was.
She was very, and I mean, just her humor. I mean, she was just able to get along with almost anyone pretty much. So I kind of, I don't know. But I saw another interview with her, and she was talking about her time with her trial with HUAC, and she said they asked her if she was a member of the Communist Party, and she said, "I'm not going to answer that." And they asked her about the East Bay Civil Rights Congress, and she said, "I won't answer." And then they said something about, "Were you part of some tennis club?" And she thought they had said something else, and she was like, "I'm not going to answer that." And everybody started laughing because I mean, it was some posh tennis club that I don't even know if she was part of, but I mean, she was able to just be humorous in any situation.
Do you think that the fact that she was kind of a woman and not seen as much of a threat to the country, that she was perhaps she didn't suffer as much backlash?
Yeah, even though, I mean, her husband, he was a lawyer, and he did a lot of civil rights work, and he also, one of his clients was the Communist Party. I mean, he suffered a lot of backlash just because he was in the public eye more at that time. I mean, she didn't start writing until she was in her 40s, so she wasn't really as prominent then. And she didn't go to HUAC until she was in her 40s. But yeah, I think just because, you know, until she started writing, she really was not that big, I guess. I mean, her family was well known in Britain at least, but not in America.
And I think the American Way of Death, in a lot of ways, turned her into a national figure.
Yeah.
The book was a bestseller. I read The American Way of Death back in the 70s. It's a disturbing book. It's a portrayal of, you know, it pulls the curtain back behind the funeral industry. And I remember particularly at a young age that I was in, of being so profoundly influenced by the chapter she had on how autopsies were, or not autopsies, embalming was carried out by the funeral industry, and it's quite disturbing. In fact, I read later that Robert Kennedy, you know, the book came out in 1963, and John Kennedy was assassinated in November of that year. Robert Kennedy had read The American Way of Death earlier that year, and it influenced a lot of decisions he made about the way John Kennedy's body was handled after his assassination.
Yeah. And a lot of people wondered what was going to happen to her when she died. She died in 96. And she was cremated and didn't even have an urn because she thought they were way too overpriced. And she was just, her ashes were scattered straight from there. So she had a very cheap funeral. But she just thought it was awful that, you know, she talked about, like when you died, the union would pay the family so much money, a union would, and all that money went to the funeral every time. And that was just unacceptable for her. I mean, you shouldn't. They were taking advantage of people in a vulnerable state. And so she thought it was ridiculous.
Any final questions before we move to Oscar Romero? Thank you very much, Hannah. Good job.